So we're going to be talking about blood gases. So we went over, this is a good transition from, I don't know, when did we talk about respiratory things? Was it 2 weeks ago, I think? This is a good add-on to that. So a lot of this is going to be some review over here. So we talked about partial pressure of oxygen, I think, right? We talked about what partial pressures are. So what the partial pressure of oxygen in the body is around 80 millimeters of mercury. So I do want y'all to learn that for this test. Now there's two versions of oxygen in your body. The first being oxyhemoglobin, which is when oxygen is bound to hemoglobin in and of itself. Hemoglobin is the oxygen transporter of the body, and so most of the oxygen that you consume, most of the oxygen that you breathe in is going to be bound to hemoglobin. But there is a small proportion of dissolved oxygen. Water has the ability to dissolve oxygen. That's how fish breathe with their gills. They filter water through their gills, and then the oxygen that's just dissolved in the water will bind to those oxygen receptors on the gills. Same thing that's going on with insofar as oxygen can be dissolved and still be utilized by cells if it's just dissolved in water, like your bloodstream or like the plasma of your bloodstream or whatever. Carbon dioxide, very similar stuff. The only thing here is that there is three versions of carbon dioxide. Your normal partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 35 to 45, and there are three forms. There's this hemoglobin. When it's at the tissue level, it migrates to the tissues, and then it'll drop off its oxygen, but then it'll also bind carbon dioxide. So that's that same oxygen binding site can also just bind carbon dioxide. And so that's one version. Another one's carbonic acid, which we're going to talk about extensively in this lecture. That's what most of this is going to focus on today. And there's dissolved carbon dioxide, which dissolves a little bit better because of those carbonyl groups, but we won't go into that. So we have carbon dioxide, right? It's I think kind of went over this, but you know, I'm done with that. So carbon dioxide works. We kind of go over the organic chemistry of it, which is going to be important. Because we're focusing so much on carbon dioxide, I do want to just remind you of this. So we got carbon dioxide, C double bondo H, C double bondo bondo. It has this linear chain, right? It's very nonpolar. These are sp3 hybridized orbitals. But what will happen is that when you add water to it, bent water, you have a carbonyl attack, oxygens move on, and you get this carbonic acid that is made. Right. So there's an H here, and then the oxygens will pick up. Long story short, if this means nothing to you, all I'm saying is that carbon dioxide in the presence of water gets converted to a carbonate ion, which looks like this. Right. So this is a carbon dioxide in the presence of water gets converted to this right here, which is carbonic acid, if you've ever heard of that term. Okay. And carbonic acid is an acid, and acids deposit hydrogen ions to solutions, right? So what will happen is one of these hydrogen ions will dissociate, and you get an O minus and an H plus ion. Okay, so you have this this chemical reaction occurring in your blood constant, just because you have carbon dioxide, right? And so carbon dioxide is in equilibrium with this carbonic acid and carbonate ion. And so what's great about this is this carbonate ion will act as a buffer. And so what you'll see is that this carbon dioxide also exists in your body as a carbonate ion. And so what we're going to be talking about today is how the acid-base balance, because of the carbon dioxide in your body, how the acid-base balance is going to be, it can be thrown off or utilized as a compensatory mechanism for respiration. Does that make sense? Just carbon dioxide can be an acid, pretty much, is what I'm saying. So acids, right? These are things that donate protons. Bases accept hydrogen ions. So looking back at here, this right here, when it's an acid, right? So C double bond O, bond OH, that's carbonic acid. This is an acid. This can donate hydrogens, but because it's bound to the molecule, it hasn't donated the hydrogen yet. But once this hydrogen gets released into solution, it donates that, and so this thing can donate a hydrogen, so it's an acid. This right here, after it's donated the hydrogen, it has this negative charge on the O because you've separated these charges. This O right here can be a base. So now it can accept this. So the way this works is that this is your acid, and this is the base that is created after you deprotonate the acid. And so what they call this is a conjugate base, which we'll get in that in a little bit. But when you have an acid and then the salt of a conjugate base, this is a buffering system. So a lot of times you'll hear in physiology how carbonate is the major buffering system of the body. The reason why is because it can switch back and forth depending on what your body needs. If your body's super basic and it needs more acid it needs more hydrogen ions in the bloodstream, what it can do is it can deprotonate all these acids, release them into the solution, and then cause the blood to be more acidic. And then the opposite is true. If it's too basic and it needs to, if it's too acidic and then it needs to revert back to being more basic, it can do the reverse of that reaction and then drag the hydrogen ions out of solution. So it buffers the changing of the pH in your body. So yeah, we have these strong acids and strong bases. Strong acids completely dissociate. Weak acids do not, only slightly dissociate. So this carbonate system is a weak acid buffer. Strong acids usually have weak conjugate bases. That's that term I was talking about. So this is that carbonic acid with the hydrogen attached. And if any word ever ends with ic acid, y'all know that that's like the acid version. But if it's I think we talked about this with folate and folic acid like a few weeks ago. If it's deprotonated that hydrogen, that's the ion right here, this conjugate base. That is the 8 version of it. So this is carbonate because the hydrogen is just deprotonated, and this is the carbonic acid because the hydrogen is still associated with it. All right. Strong acids have weak conjugate bases, and weak acids usually have strong conjugate bases. I don't really need to know that for this lecture, but there's a lot of just basic chemistry here. And then a buffer is something that can it resists changes to hydrogen ion concentration because it can accept or donate hydrogens according to whatever's changing. So this carbonate buffer system is a great example of what a buffer is. So what happens in your body, right, is that the pH can change, right? If you go into acidemia, that means you have acid in your blood, right? And if you go into alkalemia, that means you have base in your blood. And so what I do want y'all to know, and this is probably relatively you probably should have some exposure to this, but I want y'all to memorize these pH values here. So if you're less than 7.35, that's acidemia, and then if your blood is greater than 7.45, it's alkalemia. And then if you're right within that range, that's just your neutral, healthy pH. If you're between 7.35 and 7.45. Does this make sense? Like, have y'all seen a lot of these concepts before in chemistry classes and stuff? Hopefully, sometimes people need review on this kind of stuff, but it's usually not fully new. So what happens is that whenever glucose is broken down, and y'all know this through glycolysis, citric acid cycle, or tricarboxylic acid cycle, as the Gen Zers like to call it, right, as you metabolize glucose or any of your metabolites, what it'll eventually result in is release of carbon dioxide. All right, and this is just what happens whenever you're metabolizing energy in your blood system or your body, and your tissues. So this carbon dioxide gets released, and so keeping in consideration this whole buffering system, what you'd expect is that your body absorbs glucose, not an acidic molecule, right? It'll metabolize it, release carbon dioxide, and then carbon dioxide will go through this whole shift, right? Where it'll react with water because there's tons of water in your body, and it'll make this carbonic acid, right? Well, what that means is that as you metabolize glucose, that means your acidity of your body should go up, right? And so you breathe in oxygen, and then you go through this oxidative respiration of glucose, and then it makes more acid. So there should, theoretically, because we're always metabolizing food, you should always be increasing your pH throughout the just living, right? The thing is that that carbon dioxide will travel to your lungs, and then you'll breathe out. So one of the ways that we regulate our pH is through metabolism. So other acids are produced directly. So yeah, so the release of carbon dioxide and the buildup of carbonic acid, that'll increase your pH. And so but we can also remove this carbon dioxide by exhaling carbon dioxide. And that's like a regular fluctuation that you do with each breath, is increase your pH and decrease your pH, right? There's also other acids that can be produced. If you remember, glycolysis can release pyruvate, and pyruvate, to regenerate the NAD plus of metabolism, it can go through fermentation and then make things like lactic acid. And lactic acid is an acid, right? So it's going to make your blood more acidic, and if you're going through like lactic acid fermentation. So those are other things that can also contribute to the acidity of your blood, right? So these in coordination will just increase your acidity. So we talked a lot about these things. So we have this, we have the buffer system of the human body. These buffers, they can regulate, if you are going through a lot of your metabolism, they can regulate the changing pH that might occur from this. And you have a lot of buffer systems in your body. The first that we already talked about is the bicarbonate system. We also have the protein buffer system, which proteins can also absorb and release hydrogens. We all know that there's amino acids that are acidic, and that there's amino acids that are basic. It's just side reactions with those chains, mostly. There's also your phosphate buffer system, which is just a whole other buffer system. It's a lesser contributor. And there's also ammonia, interstitial fluid, bones. There's a lot of stuff that can absorb and release hydrogen ions. We're going to focus focus exclusively on the carbonate system today. So we all know about the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. It's whether or not you can determine if something is protonated or not. We won't go into that a ton today. We can just maybe skip this slide. But this is very applicable to this, because if your blood has a pH of most of the pKa of your physiological process, they're around 7-ish, and that's why buffers are so important. If your pH drops to where you're in alkalemia or acidemia, it can very much change the function of your proteins, right? pH affects protein structure, right? We've learned that in basic biology, right? And then there's also, so y'all won't need to know Henderson-Hasselbalch or be able to do that for the test, so just forget that kind of thing. What I do want y'all to know, though, is we have this buffering system, and it's kind of delineated in a line equation right here. We have carbon dioxide interacts with water, creates this carbonate ion, and then the carbonate can dissociate and act as an acid and dissociate into its conjugate parts. So as you breathe, right, you increase the amount of carbon dioxide that builds up in your tissues, right? And so that's what that's going to do is it's going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide. And because of that, you have an increase in carbonic acid. And because you have an increase in carbonic acid, you have an increase in pH. Sorry, you have a decrease in pH, which is an increase in hydrogen concentration. And then the opposite's true. Whenever you breathe out and you get rid of all your carbon dioxide, you shift the equilibrium the other direction. You increase the pH, which decreases the amount of hydrogen ions in your body. So what that means is that your breathing regulates your pH in your body. Does that make sense? And so that's a very important thing. So what we're going to talk about is respiratory alkemia and respiratory acidemia, where you have, because of the rate of respiration that you're going through, you have regulations of your pH. And you'll see that system. So there are things that cause respiratory acidosis, right? Which is just acidemia, another term for it. And so there's a whole slew of them. You can kind of see them on here. Well, I'm going to simplify this for y'all's test, and I just want y'all to learn these three right here. So just know that these things cause respiratory acidosis. There's reasons why for all of them, but I'm going to save on some time and not go over that. So yeah, just try to memorize that little list for the, and then take a look at the rest of them. But just memorize those three for the test. And then there's also, so this is, okay, whatever. This is common causes of acidosis, and then this is the opposite. This is a common causes of alkalosis, where your pH is going up, decreasing your hydrogen concentration, right? And these include inflammation, bacteremia, and overventilation. Again, take a look at the rest of them, but we talked about a couple of these. I think we talked about tumors before, where we said that cancers increase your pH, and so because your pH is increased, you breathe more, and so because you're breathing more, you're getting rid of more carbon dioxide. So it increases your respiratory alkalosis. But yeah, just memorize those. There's kind of four here: having bacteria in your blood and the fever response to that bacteria, as well as inflammation and overventilation with mechanical ventilators, which is very important for people doing like going through surgery, right? There's also, so there's respiratory alkalosis and acidosis, and then there's metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, right? So these disorders come about by just your metabolism increasing the amount of carbon dioxide that's in your tissues, and because there's an increase in carbon dioxide, there is a decrease in pH, increase in the carbonate equilibrium. You're forcing that equilibrium, right? So, yeah, I kind of mentioned all this before, right? So, there's also this base ion gap. It's where the basic excess or it's where you have a base excess or deficit, and acid is needed to titrate the acids and bases that are present there. So it's this whole it's this equilibrium that exists where it's kind of measuring the amount of sodium and chloride relative to total ions in your body, and normally it's between 12. Normally it's around 12 plus or minus 4 milliequivalents per liter. So if it's greater than that range, you have lactic acidosis, ketoacidosis, or organic ions kind of appear. You have renal retention of sulfates and phosphates or urates, and it'll lead to decreases in the ions. So it's important in determining the cause of this metabolic acidosis. So these are these are like the things I want y'all to memorize here: alcohol, diarrhea, and ARDS. Those are all causes of metabolic acidosis. And then you can kind of take a look at the rest. And then these are some main causes of metabolic acidosis. So and then one of the last things we'll talk about is compensatory mechanisms, right? So if there's a buildup of acid or bases in your body, just like we've seen this a lot in physiology, where it has a compensatory mechanisms to where if you have slight fluctuations, your body can fix these things, right? So if you have, for example, metabolic acidosis, you have an increase in metabolism, which leads to an increase in acid in your body, like we talked about. Well, you can, if you breathe more, you can get rid of the carbon dioxide that builds up and then release the carbon dioxide. It'll shift all the equilibrium to reducing the pH. And then same is true for the flip of that. If you have metabolic alkalosis, you have a whole bunch of base buildup in your body, you can decrease your ventilation and shift the equilibrium to increase the amount of hydrogen ions in your blood. So these are really good compensatory mechanisms that are really good for your day-to-day fluctuations in your pH, and your body will also use these same compensatory mechanisms if things get in a pathological place for a certain degree, right? The problem is when these compensatory mechanisms can't keep up, just like we've seen all the time. When the compensatory mechanisms can't keep up with the severe amounts of fluctuations, in this case it's pH, that's when your acid starts turning acidic, or your blood starts turning acidic. There's also, so that's your respiratory compensatory mechanism. There's also the renal compensatory mechanism, which we talked about in the chronic kidney disorders lecture, where you have one of the functions of your kidney is to secrete or absorb or reabsorb hydrogen ions to where you can just directly secrete hydrogen ions and get rid of acids in that way. Another thing is you can also, and this can be done with the hydrogen ions directly with the bicarbonate ions or with diluting pH by retaining or excreting water. So again, kidneys are very important for pH balance, just like your lungs are. And so these are the two main compensatory mechanisms of how you can regulate this in a day-to-day basis. So as far as the test goes, what we're gonna need to do is, this is like a really good slide for y'all to take a look at for the test questions. So the test question is going to be like this. It's going to give you a situation where I'm going to give you the pH, I'm going to give you the partial pressure of oxygen, and then the carbonate levels. Okay, and what you can do, I think this is a really good picture where it kind of talks about how you go through these questions. So the first thing you're going to look at is, what is the pH? Right? Is it above 7 or below 7? Right? It's not really 7, but it's that range that's on the slide earlier. So you're going to have to determine, is it basic or acidic, or is it normal? And that's like the first thing you do. The second thing you do is look at the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And that's going to determine what is your respiration, what is the contribution of carbon dioxide from respiration. At high levels, that means the respiratory system is lowering the pH and vice versa, right? And then the next thing you're going to look at is the carbonate ion levels. And I'm going to give you normal physiological ranges. You'll have to memorize the pH ones, the pH normal physiological ranges, but I'm going to give you the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the carbonate normal physiological range. So the number will be there for you. You just got to compare it to the given value. If the pH is acidic, you look for the number that corresponds with the lower pH. So if it's respiratory acidosis, the CO2 level will be high. And if it's metabolic acidosis, the carbonate ions will be low. So And then for the basic conditions, if it's respiratory alkalosis, the CO2 is low, and if it's metabolic acidosis, the carbonate ion contribution is high. So ultimately what it's going to come down to is I'm going to give you a situation, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of numbers, and you're just going to have to tell me, is it respiratory acidosis, metabolic acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, and metabolic alkalosis? And you'll see that in these practice tests that I'll give you all this weekend. And then, so the last little thing, the last twist will be a couple of your questions will just be what those 4 options and you answer it. The last thing would be like, given this situation, you know, and the situation will reflect metabolic acidosis, for example, you know, which of the following might be causing this situation, and it'll be like alcohol will be one of your options, and then your other 3 will be like, I don't know, these 3, right? And to where, you know, you can look at the situation, pick out that it's metabolic acidosis, and then you'll say, oh, okay, it's alcohol. Does that make sense? So yeah, just kind of, so yeah, run through this, and then you'll see it in the, practice test questions, kind of some good examples here. And you'll have to do this for both this and the final in 2 weeks. So just make sure to learn this well. And then if you can do it really well for the test, then you should be good for the final as well. Does that make sense? All right. Cool.